Sophia never thought that this morning would be her last. One moment, she was reaching for a glass of water. The next, everything went dark. But death wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new journey. From above, she watched her body, still and statue-like. A force pulled her into a vast darkness, filled with unsettling whispers. It felt like she had fallen into some kind of hell. Fear paralyzed her, until suddenly a bright light pierced the darkness. Jesus appeared before her. And what he revealed about the future and the sign would change everything. For most of my life, I never thought I'd tell this story. My name is Sophia. I once lived a life of quiet devotion, far from the chaos of the world. I had completely dedicated myself to God, taking my vows as a nun at a young age. My days were marked by prayer, service, and solitude, seeking only to draw closer to Christ. Outside the convent, life rushed by at a relentless pace. But within those walls, I found my purpose, caring for the poor, helping the sick, and praying for lost souls. I never doubted my calling. I relied on God to guide my path, believing He had placed me exactly where I needed to be. My life was simple, without wealth, ambition, or power. None of that mattered to me. Only faith mattered. But that day, everything changed. If someone had told me I would die and come back with an urgent message, I would have dismissed the idea without hesitation. I had read about near-death experiences, but they seemed distant, stories that happened to other people, never to me. Yet that morning, the unthinkable happened. It began with a weakness I couldn't explain. For days, my body had felt heavy, my breath short. I ignored it, thinking it was tiredness from fasting and long hours of prayer. I had always pushed my body in devotion, trusting that God would sustain me. That morning was no different. I rose, before dawn, as I had for years, as rain beat against my small window. The air was cold and damp. I reached for my Bible, but my hands trembled. A strange numbness crept into my fingers. I ignored it and stood up, but my legs wobbled beneath me. Something was wrong. I just needed some water, a moment to recover. But as I reached for the glass beside my bed, my vision blurred. The room spun, a crushing weight pressed against my chest. Sile, maumai, mabrele stikidestiveth. The glass slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor. The world around me began to fade. I tried to resist, clutching at the wooden table, but my strength left me. My legs gave way. The last thing I remember is the cold floor against my skin, the sound of hurried footsteps, and a voice, urgent, muffled, calling my name. Then, nothing. Just darkness. In that moment, the life I had known was over. But my journey had just begun. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of everything. No pain, no breath, no weight, only stillness. For a fleeting moment I thought I was dreaming, trapped in that strange space between sleep and waking. But as awareness crept in, the truth became clear. I was no longer in my body. From above I saw myself lying motionless on the cold stone floor. My clothes pooled around me, my skin eerily pale. My lips were slightly parted as if I'd tried to speak just before I fell. But my chest wasn't rising, I wasn't breathing. Then, a voice. Elena, I realized. My neighbor. Her frantic cries broke the silence. Oh God, someone please help! She was at the doorway, her face pale, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone. I knew I should have felt something. Panic, urgency, the desperate need to yell and tell her I was still there. But I didn't. Instead, a strange calmness washed over me, as if I was simply a spectator in someone else's story. I tried to move, to take a step forward, but I had no feet, no hands, no form to reach out with. Yet I was aware, more aware than I had ever been. Then something unseen grabbed me. It wasn't hands that grasped me, but a force, an invisible current that pulled at the core of my being, dragging me upwards. I had no control, no way to resist. Weightless, I rose, effortlessly. My room, the shattered glass, Elena's screams, everything faded beneath me. I passed through the ceiling as if it wasn't there, rising higher and higher into something vast and unknown. Then, the world I knew vanished completely. Darkness enveloped me. Not the peaceful darkness of night, nor the soft gloom of a dying candle. This was something deeper, heavier, almost alive. It surrounded me, stretched endlessly in every direction, pressing against me like an endless void. At first, there was silence. Then came the whispers. They began as distant murmurs, hushed, almost mournful, but they grew louder, overlapping, multiplying. The voices carried pain, regret, and something far worse: despair. Some cried out in anguish, others pleaded, some raged with anger. I tried to turn around, searching for where the voices were coming from, but there was no direction. I was floating in emptiness, a soul without a body, a mind without form. A terrible realization hit me. Was this hell? Was I being judged? I had given my life to God, through prayer and service, but I wasn't perfect. I had doubted, questioned, and failed. Was this my punishment? The thought filled me with dread, and the voices around me grew louder. The darkness deepened like a coming storm. I wanted to scream, but I had no voice. I wanted to run, but I had no legs. Then, from the emptiness, something moved. It wasn't a person or any definite shape, but a presence, vast, heavy, suffocating. I felt it watching me. Even though I couldn't see anything, the soft whispers turned into pained groans, and terror gripped me. "Oh God, help me," I prayed silently. Then I noticed a light. At first it was a faint glimmer, no bigger than a distant star, but it cut through the darkness with such force that even the shadows seemed to shrink back. In that instant, the voices hesitated, and the oppressive presence paused. The light began to grow, spreading outward and washing over me in a wave of golden warmth. The darkness seemed to scream as unseen chains around me shattered. The light drew closer, and I realized I was no longer alone. Someone, something, was coming for me. In that moment, I understood that I was being rescued. The light enveloped me, burning away the shadows that had threatened to consume me. A warmth, unlike anything I had ever known, flooded every part of my being. The pained whispers faded into a deep stillness. Then I saw him. At first, he was just a distant figure, standing in the center of the radiant glow. As he approached, I felt an indescribable presence, both powerful and gentle. His very essence radiated love, sorrow, and something else. Urgency. Jesus. The moment our eyes met, every fiber of my being recognized him. He wasn't just a man or a teacher. He was the Alpha and the Omega, the living God. His eyes, deep and knowing, carried the weight of eternity, yet they shone with compassion. As he looked at me, I fell to my knees, not by choice, but because I couldn't do anything else. In his presence, everything I had ever known paled in comparison. Every bit of my past, my prayers, my sacrifices, seemed like nothing more than a soft murmur against the overwhelming majesty of his glory. For what felt like forever, I couldn't speak, though I soon realized that words weren't necessary. He understood everything about me. Finally, he reached out his hand, and his voice, gentle yet firm, echoed deep within my soul. "See for yourself," he said. At those words, the light around us shifted, and the comforting warmth vanished. In an instant, I was no longer standing before him. I found myself in a completely different place, A sprawling city that shimmered with towering buildings, flashing lights, and crowds of people moving in an almost hypnotic synchronization. Everything was orderly, efficient, and tightly controlled. At first glance, the scene appeared peaceful. But looking closer, I noticed subtle details. The robotic gait of the people, their expressions devoid of any real emotion, their mechanical movements as if something essential had been taken away. Then I saw it. A small mark, barely noticeable, placed on their right hand or forehead. It was everywhere. On billboards, digital screens, and at glowing kiosks where people scanned their hands to enter buildings, buy food, or take transportation. No one questioned it. No one resisted. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. This wasn't simply a political system or an economic strategy. It was something far deeper. The mark wasn't being forced upon them. They were accepting it willingly. By embracing it, they had given up something priceless, something eternal. Jesus' voice echoed within me again, filled with sorrow yet firm. They will say they have no choice, but I will provide. His words wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I understood then that the people in this vision had chosen the mark, not out of wickedness, but out of fear. Fear of hunger, of rejection, of losing their place in the world. Then the scene shifted. Now I saw those who had refused the mark. They weren't part of the gleaming city. They were the outcasts. I saw a mother in a crowded market, her children clinging to her sides. She offered a handful of coins for some bread, but the vendor just shook his head and pointed to a scanner. Without the mark, she was denied the right to buy. Tears welled in her eyes as she gathered her children and walked away empty-handed. I also saw a man in a hospital, desperately begging for medicine for his wife, only to be met with a sad shake of the doctor's head. No mark meant no service. I saw entire families forced from their homes, left to wander the streets simply because they refused to comply. And then I saw the hunters. These were the ones tasked with tracking down the unmarked and bringing them to the re-education centers. They weren't soldiers, just neighbors, friends, even family members. The world had turned against them. Society branded them as dangerous extremists, obstacles to progress. It wasn't just persecution, it was a complete denial of their right to exist. Then the vision shifted again and I saw those who had accepted the mark. At first, they looked the same. But when I looked into their eyes, I saw only emptiness. It started subtly, a dullness, a lack of light. But over time, they became hollow. Their emotions faded, the love for their families disappeared. I saw a woman who once cradled her baby with tenderness now turn away as if the child were nothing. I saw a husband dismiss his wife, who had refused the mark, as if she were a stranger. They had sacrificed something far more precious than their freedom. They had given up their souls. The vision dissolved, and suddenly I was back in front of Jesus. My heart pounded, and tears stung my eyes. I wanted to beg him to undo it all, to stop it from happening, to change what I had seen. But his eyes were filled with sorrow as he said, "It has already begun." I tried to protest, but he raised his hand. "Tell them," he commanded, his voice like thunder, yet filled with love. "Warn them, time is short." I could barely speak, but I asked, "How will they survive without the mark?" His gaze softened. "The world will tell them they have no choice, but I will provide." In that moment I realized this wasn't simply a fight for survival. It was a test, a final, eternal decision. The mark wasn't just a tool of control, it was an act of spiritual submission. Then the vision began to fade as the light around him grew blinding. I felt myself being pulled back toward something familiar, something painful, something human. I gasped, and I woke up. Yet, the vision didn't end. Even as the image of the empty-eyed masses faded, I was drawn to another scene. This time, the world seemed different, darker, colder. The very air felt heavier, thick with a silent oppression. But this wasn't the city of the marked. This was where the unmarked had been driven. I saw them, men, women, children, the ones who had refused the mark. They were everywhere, wandering deserted streets, taking shelter in abandoned buildings and hiding in the depths of forests and mountains, far from prying eyes. Their clothes were worn and their faces were etched with hunger, but in their eyes shone a spark that the marked had long lost. I saw a man, once a respected doctor, now picking through garbage for food, his name erased, his credentials revoked. I saw a young woman, once a teacher, sitting outside an abandoned church, clutching a small Bible, her fingers trembling in the dim moonlight. I saw an elderly couple, once surrounded by children and grandchildren, now alone after their own family reported them, branding them dangerous for refusing the mark. The world had cast them aside. Society had decided they no longer deserved to exist. At first, those who resisted the mark tried to blend in within the cities, hoping to survive unnoticed. But the system allowed no neutrality. Without the mark, they were quickly identified. They couldn't buy food, rent a home, or receive medical care. Banks froze their accounts, and employers fired them. They became ghosts, forced out of society. Many fled, and I saw small groups forming in the wilderness, hidden communities of believers. They gathered in forests, on mountainsides, and in underground hideouts, places where they wouldn't be found. They had no modern comforts, no electricity, no stores, no hospitals, yet they clung to their faith. Then something amazing happened. I saw a man kneel on the dry, cracked earth, his hands raised in prayer. Behind him his family stood, their faces gaunt with hunger. They hadn't eaten in days. With a trembling voice he prayed, "Lord, you fed Elijah in the desert. You gave manna to the Israelites. You are the same God." As his words quivered in the night, something stirred in the barren ground. Before their eyes, plants began to sprout, vines laden with fruit and roots that grew deep and strong. Food appeared where there was nothing. Then I saw another group sheltering in a cave, huddled around a child, burning with fever. With no medicine at hand, a woman gently laid her hands on the child's forehead, tears falling silently. "Jesus, you healed the sick. You made the blind see. If we can't turn to the world, we turn to you." At her plea, the child shuddered, and their fever vanished in an instant. Yet not all remained steadfast. Some wavered, hesitant in the face of such desperate hope. I saw a man, once firm in his faith, now trembling as he held his starving daughter. "How can I let her suffer?" he whispered. "Surely God would understand if I took the mark just to feed her." Tears filled his eyes as he looked at his wife, silently pleading for her agreement. But she just shook her head. "If we lose everything, but save our souls, we've lost nothing. But if we gain the world and lose our souls, then we've lost everything." Torn, the man turned away, wrestling with his decision. Some would cling to their faith, while others would give in. Then the words of Jesus echoed within me. "They will be told they have no choice, but I will provide." Then Jesus revealed one final vision to me. I saw a woman standing amidst the ruins of a small town. Once wealthy, powerful, a true leader among her people, she now had nothing. Facing a government official, she was offered one last chance. "Take the mark, and you can have your life back. Food, shelter, a home. You don't have to suffer anymore." She hesitated. Her hands trembled. Then, with quiet determination, she looked the official in the eye and shook her head. "My life, is not my own. I witnessed the cost of her choice as she was led away. Yet, even as she went, her face radiated a peaceful light. I knew she had not been abandoned. She had been chosen. The vision faded, and once more I stood before Jesus. His eyes were filled with sorrow, yet they held a glimmer of hope. The scene shifted again, and I found myself in the middle of a huge city, a place that looked nothing like the world I knew. Everything was bright, clean, and organized, incredibly efficient. Digital screens flashed messages of unity, progress, and peace. People moved in perfect sync, their faces blank, their eyes empty. This was the new world, a world where everyone had accepted the mark. At first glance, it seemed peaceful, no crime, no conflict. But looking closer, I began to see the true nature of that peace. Peace had been achieved, but at a terrible cost. These people weren't themselves anymore. I saw a mother walk past a child huddled in an alleyway. The boy, his face dirty, his small hands outstretched, whispered, "Mommy." Yet she kept walking, not even pausing to acknowledge him. She had accepted the mark. Her love, her very soul, was gone. The scene shifted again, and I found myself at a remote outpost, far from the cities, where the unmarked had taken refuge. These were the last of those who refused to submit. They lived in hiding, scraping by, waiting for the inevitable. Then the day came. I saw soldiers advancing in tight, perfect formation, their faces emotionless, weapons gleaming in the dim light. Behind them was a man in a suit, calm, composed, his voice smooth and almost kind. "We don't want to hurt you," he said. "We want to help you. The world has moved on. You don't have to suffer anymore." But no one moved. Then came the final temptation. The man gestured to a group of children, frail and starving, ribs showing through their ragged clothes. "Think of your children," he said softly. "Is your pride worth their suffering? Give them a future. Let them eat. Let them live." Some parents wept, hands trembling. Others stepped forward. I saw a woman holding a malnourished baby sob as she whispered, "Forgive me." And then she accepted the mark. Her husband reached for her hand, but the moment she accepted it, something in her changed. She turned away from him, her eyes cold. She didn't see him anymore, didn't care. Yet there were others who refused. They stood together, weary but unyielding, hands clasped in silent prayer. A gaunt man stepped forward, not to surrender, but to speak. "You cannot take what belongs to God," he declared. "We have already made our choice." The man in the suit sighed. "So be it." Then the soldiers raised their weapons, and the sky opened. A brilliant light, brighter than the sun and more vivid than life itself, poured down. The soldiers stumbled, shielding their eyes from its intensity, while the unmarked stood firm, their faces radiant, their burdens seemingly lifted. Jesus had arrived. In that moment, the vision shattered. A force far more powerful than anything I had ever known pulled me back, dragging me through layers of burning light and impenetrable darkness. I felt like I was plummeting, falling through eternity, rushing towards something familiar, something heavy, then crashing into pain. A gasping breath tore through my lungs as air rushed in, and my chest ached with every beat. My limbs grew weak, and suddenly my frail human body was mine again. I was back. Then I heard an urgent, desperate voice. "Sophia." "Oh, thank God." "Stay with me," she pleaded. It was Elena, her hands gripping mine, tears streaming down her face. The room spun, my vision blurred, and my body trembled from the strain of returning to life. I was alive, yet I wasn't the same person I was before. I understood why I had returned. To warn you. The world is changing. A big moment is coming. A decision way bigger than just surviving. It's a test of faith. I've seen what's waiting, what happens to those who give up, and the strength of those who don't. Jesus is coming back. When that time comes, there's no middle ground, just a clear choice. Will you stand strong, or will you give in? The time to choose is now.